So welcome everyone to the second seminar in our new online lecture series on resource struggles and international law under occupation, convened by myself, Julia Dem, and my colleagues Sahiba Mukwal and Caitlin Murphy. Before introducing our speaker, we want to acknowledge that we're joining the seminar from occupied land and that struggles for land justice, for water justice, and resource justice continue across this continent. We want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining this meeting from, and that their land was stolen and their sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders past and present.
So this online lecture series seeks to foster interdisciplinary and historically inflected discussions about how international law both shapes and is shaped by struggles over natural resources. In this semester, semester 2, the lecture series is going to focus on resource struggles in the context of occupation around the world. We're collectively exploring how struggles over resource plunder and exploitation shape the dynamics of occupation, and how peoples under occupation are contesting extraction and asserting ownership and sovereignty over resources as part of broader resistance movements. So speakers are examining resource struggles under occupation in Greenland, West Papua, Palestine, Kashmir, Bougainville, and Western Sahara, in order to consider the different forms of political contestation that they produce and how resource struggles might be mobilized to enliven political possibilities for self-determination and decolonisation.
We are delighted to have a wonderful line of speakers for our second semester, as well as Dr. Sophie Chao, who we will hear from today. We will have lectures from Professor Michael Link and Dr. Hadil Abu Hussain on Palestine, Dr. Omar Ejazi on Kashmir, Professor Kristen Laslett on Bougainville, and Dr. Randy Irwin on Western Sahara. Details of these lectures are in the chat, and I'm putting in shortly. Additionally, Dr. Anna Saunders and Julia are convening a reading group on the theme of making and unmaking natural resources. If you are interested, more details will be in the chat shortly. Thank you.
I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Sophie Chao is a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Sydney. Her research investigates the intersections of indigeneity, ecology, capitalism, health, and justice in the Pacific. She is the author of In the Shadow of the Palms, More Than Human Becomings in West Papua from 2022, and Land of Famished Beings, West Papuan Theories of Hunger, that just came out this year, as well as co-editor of The Promise of Multispecies Justice, which were all published by Duke University Press. She previously worked for the Indigenous rights organisation Forest Peoples Program. So over to you, Sophie. Thank you again for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Caitlin and Sahiba and Julia, for inviting me to speak within this series. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to be online with us this afternoon. I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and I want to start by paying my respects to Gadigal elders past, present, and emergent, and also to Gadigal kin, both human, animal, vegetal, spiritual, more than human, and more than natural. So, as Julia introduced, I'm coming to this talk as an environmental anthropologist and multi-species studies scholar who has a long-standing interest in questions of justice, ecology, plantation capitalism, indigeneity, and health in the Pacific, with a particular ethnographic focus on Indonesia. Much of this research has sort of coalesced a number of works, some of which Julia mentioned, a monograph on Indigenous experiences and theories of plantation capitalism in West Papua, an edited volume on the question of justice beyond the individual human subject, co-edited with Karen Bolender, Eben Kirksey, and most recently a book that problematizes what hunger, food, and nourishment mean in this age of self-consuming capitalist growth. Across these different works, the question of justice, both for humans and non-humans, emerges as central. And I'm going to try to bring this justice lens into the fold of today's presentation, and in doing so, invite us to rethink or interrogate, perhaps, the classification or understanding of the non-human as resource, and also by extension of some humans as resources. But to start this talk, let me begin by sharing with you a story from the field that I think speaks to justice, or the lack thereof, in plantations as landscapes of empire. In late May 2016, Petrus, a 3-year-old marined boy from the Indonesian-occupied region of West Papua, died of dysentery after drinking river water contaminated with pesticides from a nearby oil palm plantation. Petrus's grieving parents, Marina and Bernardus, portrayed here, carried their child to the headquarters of the company, some 20 kilometers away by foot. They asked that their infant be buried in their clan's ancestral graveyard, located within the newly established oil palm plantation. The company refused. The land was now their property. Burying the child in the plantation would, they said, attract insects, fungi, and other pests that would harm the oil palm trees. Bernardus and Marina then pleaded for Petrus to be buried in the plantation's conservation zone, a 10 by 20 meter patch of sago palm groves amidst a sea of monocrop oil palms, so that they said the child could rest with his plant and animal kin. This request too was denied. In the interests of protecting local flora and fauna, access to the conservation zone was prohibited to non-company personnel. Finally, Bernardus and Marina buried their child a few miles outside their village and plantation, by the side of the Trans-Irian Highway, a national development project initiated by the Indonesian government to enhance regional economic connectivity across West Papua. Since then, the couple told me, their nights have been haunted by nightmares of Petrus's frail body being trampled by trucks overloaded with palm oil fruit, and by bulldozers clearing the forest to make way for more oil palm. The parents described how isolated and frightened Petrus appeared in their dreams, alone by the dusty highway, severed from the forest he was born in, never able to find rest. Since oil palm arrived, Marina explained, we marined people have been robbed of our forests. The companies cut the forests. They also protect some forests. But now all of the forests belong to the companies. The law sides with the companies and the government, not the people, not the trees, not the animals. Now, we marined and our plant and animal siblings, amai, have no place to live or die in peace. Petrus and his family are one of many in the Upper Bian area of Merauke province, a district of the Indonesian-controlled province of West Papua, who have become victims to the violence of oil palm, an introduced plant that is proliferating across the lands of Marine in the guise of monocrops. Since 2008, agro-industrial expansion in the region has accelerated following the implementation of the Merauke Integrated Food and Energy Estate, a government-endorsed agribusiness mega-scheme intended to enhance Indonesia's self-sufficiency in basic foodstuffs, including palm oil. Today, Agustinus and Marina's home village of Bayau, along with a dozen others along the upper reaches of the Bian River, are encircled by oil palm monocrops, covering several hundred thousands of hectares of former forest. In the last decade, vast swells of these forests have been felled and several rivers diverted to irrigate the newly established plantations. With dozens of national and foreign companies being granted additional business permits, agribusiness continues to expand relentlessly across the region. Drawing on ethnographic fieldwork conducted on the Papuan plantation frontier, this paper examines the intersecting social and ecological injustices shaping the life world of marined and their more than human ecologies. I begin by considering how processes of mass deforestation and agro-industrial plantation expansion radically undermine Marine's intimate and ancestral kinships with sentient forest plants and animals, as well as the moral principles that undergird interspecies relations. I explore how these transformations are exacerbated by conservation practices that are undertaken in the name of corporate sustainability, but that are problematically premised upon an assumed divide between humans and the environment. I then situate the exclusion of marine from natures both exploited and preserved within histories of violence and discrimination against Papuans under Indonesian rule. Drawing from marine philosophies, practices, and protocols of more than human relationality, the paper reflects on how marine themselves conceive of the possibility of justice now and in the future, for themselves, forest organisms, and oil palm, amidst these multiple, overlapping, and intersecting injustices. Such philosophies, I will argue, call for an expansion of the scope and subjects of justice beyond the human, that remain nonetheless acutely attentive to the violence of racial colonial capitalism on Indigenous peoples themselves as subjects of entrenched and emerging racializing assemblages and top-down developmental projects. Exploring Indigenous experiences and visions of justice in the Papuan oil palm nexus, this paper seeks to contribute to the emergent and interdisciplinary field of multispecies justice, a current that aims to develop more capacious, inclusive, and expansive concepts and practices of justice, ones that recognize other than humans as legitimate subjects of the law and objects of harm, from animals and plants to ecosystems and landscapes. Grounding my analysis in the experiences and discourses of marine themselves, I ask, how are Indigenous ways of being, belonging, and becoming with other than humans transforming as a result of injustices wrought by capitalism, conservationism, and colonialism? How does injustice or justice manifest for native plants and animals that are threatened by the forces of techno-capitalism, but also for organisms like oil palm that thrive at the very heart of the agro-industrial nexus? How can we reconcile justice for more than humans with justice for marginalized Indigenous communities who themselves continue to be treated as subhuman and disposable before the law? Let me flesh out for you now the ethnographic setting where this story unfolds. Marinda, the Upper Bian region of Papua, who number around 600 households, depend primarily on hunting, fishing, and gathering for their subsistence. The lands and forests they rely on, however, represent far more than purely a source of food and livelihood. Rather, these landscapes are considered to be animate and sentient entities, populated by a myriad other than humans who together are said to render place alive, hidup. Each marine clan, or bawan, entertains a particular relationship to a group of species and elements whom they call their grandparents, amai, or siblings, namek, and with whom they share common descent from dema, or ancestral creator spirits. Marines other than human siblings include the grasslands, river floodplains, and dense swamp forests. They encompass serpentine rivers, monsoonal rains, and vast wetlands. The liveliness of this landscape arises from the presence, movements, and interactions between various animal kin, migratory birds, waterfowl, waders, cassowaries, tree kangaroos, possums, and crocodiles. Plants, too, participate in the ecocosmology of the forest through their patterns of propagation and senescence, from tall sedge grasses and low swamp grasses to melaleuca swamp forests, nipa palm clusters, and dense sago palm groves. Each of these entities is considered by Marine to be conscious, autonomous, and agentive. Each participates alongside humans in shaping the landscape through its movements, relations, and interactions. Reciprocal acts of exchange and care between humans and non-humans are what enable them to, in marine parlance, share skin and wetness, an expression that refers to the transfer of life-sustaining bodily fluids achieved through physical activities in the forest. For instance, as they hunt, forage, fish, process sago, and consume forest foods, marine take in the skin and wetness of the diverse organisms that inhabit them in the form of grease, blood, flesh, water, sap, mud, and pith, and they impart their own human bodily wetness to those with whom they undertake these activities. Those who eat sago, for instance, take in the moisture of the sago palm, the wetness of the rivers, soils, and organisms that sustain sago's growth, and the sweat of the people with whom they rasp, leach, and consume sago pith. Those who eat meat absorb the sweat, blood, and fat of the game captured, along with that of its hunters. It is these exchanges of flesh and fluid that enable humans and non-humans to participate as interagentive members of a shared community of life. The last decade, the arrival of monocrops into Merauke has radically undermined the intimate and ancestral relations binding Marine to their plant and animal kin. All palm monocrops established by the government and corporations are often heavily guarded and located in close proximity to army garrisons and police headquarters. Villagers who attempt to enter these privatized zones face intimidation and harassment from military patrols hired by the companies to guard their property. But it is not only Marine who are adversely affected by plantation proliferation. Indeed, few of their native kin can survive in industrial or palm ecologies, and their low canopies, unstable microclimates, sparse undergrowth, high temperatures, and toxic melange of chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. Conserved forest fragments within plantations are vulnerable to edge effects, whereby forest quality deteriorates over time, causing species communities to shift to simpler compositions, dominated by a handful of common types. Robbed of their water, nutrients, and symbiotes, plants and animals that once thrived in the forest now wilt and starve. Meanwhile, sites where meaningful encounters with plant and animal kin once occurred, and that are commemorated by Marine through intergenerationally transmitted myths, lore, stories, and song, are replaced by a homogeneous landscape devoid of referential markers, where everything looks exactly the same no matter how far one walks or in which direction. An uncanny silence presides, punctured only by what Marine described as the sounds of destruction: trucks, bulldozers, chainsaws, and fume-chugging mills. The skin of the landscape, people would tell me, is becoming flaky, dry, and wizened, and the wetness of watercourses contaminated with toxic chemicals used as pesticides and herbicides within the plantations. These toxins do not end their lethal trajectories in the flesh of human and other than human individuals. Rather, they continue to contaminate and kill those who touch or consume them, for instance, through the milk of childbearing mothers, the sweaty palms of hunters, the blood and grease of captured game, the meat and scales of riverine fish, and the starchy pith of felled sago palms. Here, chemically mediated injustices proliferate across kin and kind, but also across time and space, condemning the bodies of beings to illness and pain through their latent and lethal effects. The ontology of the plant that is oil palm itself matters to this story of plantation injustice. Oil palm was often described by my Marine friends as a colonizer, intruder, or occupier that has no place within Marine's more than human socialities. Its arrival signals the obliteration of the ecologies necessary for Marines other than human kin to survive and thrive. In contrast to these native forest species who entertain relations of reciprocal and restrained care with their human counterparts since time immemorial, oil palm, a recently introduced species in West Papua, is widely characterized by Marine as destructive, voracious, and greedy, a being, they say, who does not know how to share space or time with others. Whereas native forest organisms sustain each other's existence through everyday exchanges of skin and wetness, oil palm refuses to coexist with other life forms in the plantation environment. Its seemingly relentless proliferation is also associated by some Marine with insatiable and unsustainable greed. As Marine villager Sally explained to me, oil palm is always hungry for more land and more water. It devours everything in its path, the trees, the cassowaries, the rivers. It does not think about what Amai need to survive. It does not seem to care about the well-being of others, the plants, the animals, or us Marine, end quote. Operating negatively towards all that does not sustain it then, oil palm, in Marine perspectives, replaces the moral and effective topography of the sentient forest with an ecology of fear that pervades the everyday life of the humans and non-humans displaced or dispossessed by oil palm's proliferation. The injustices committed against Marine and their more than human kin in the context of plantation expansion are compounded by injustices stemming from conservation initiatives in Merauke. In tandem to monocrop developments, a range of environmental conservation projects have recently been implemented by agribusiness corporations, often with the support of environmental NGOs, including Greenpeace, as part of their commitment to responsible palm oil production under international certification standards such as the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil. Yet, despite their purportedly beneficial value in protecting forest biodiversity, conservation zones are a source of widespread consternation, frustration, and even sorrow for many of my marine friends. For starters, what distinguishes a high from a low conservation zone is unclear. Plant and animal kin, my friends emphasized, depend upon all kinds of ecologies for their subsistence, reproduction, and growth. Swamps, marshlands, mangroves, savanna forest, and more. When only certain ecosystems are deemed valuable to conserve, those that fall outside of this category become sacrifice zones, or areas that are by default assumed to be available for exploitation. Whilst plants and animals are restricted to the conservation zone as a bounded space of livability, marine now find themselves excluded from areas where they once hunted, foraged, and fished, as these zones are strictly out of bounds to all but company personnel, conservation scientists, and sustainability auditors. Reciprocal relations of care between diverse organisms are thwarted by a stratification come dissection of space and species that runs counter to Marin's understanding of the forest as a realm enlivened by the symbiotic interactions of humans and non-humans. In the process, the unjust exclusion of marine from the ecologies that nourish and sustain them goes hand in hand with the unjust severance of sentient ecologies from the humans who care for and maintain them. Conservation practices in the plantation sector, then, are very much predicated on the belief that biodiversity protection is best achieved by isolating ecosystems from humans reframed as sources of disturbance. This model, which perpetuates the colonial paradigm of fortress conservation, is anchored in turn in an assumed divide between human/culture and the environment/nature. It excludes communities by conjuring natures worth preserving as pristine, untouched zones of wilderness, while simultaneously erasing indigenous place-based histories. It is designed by scientific experts who originate from outside Merauke and who rarely consult Marind when planning, surveying, and implementing conservation projects. It also ignores the fact that human interactions with forest ecosystems may in fact enhance biological diversity, whilst also fulfilling the need of people themselves. In sum, then, conservation practices produce injustice because they elide the intrinsic engagement of humans with their environments and the encompassment of non-human life forms within the multi-species society that constitutes nature itself. It comes as little surprise, then, that for many marine, protected areas and agribusiness projects are but two sides of the same coin. Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powers White reminds us, it is difficult for Indigenous peoples to imagine new futures when climate injustice, environmental injustice, and its social impacts represent not a novelty, but rather an intensification, or déjà vu, of pre-existing imperial capitalist regimes. Similarly, injustices committed today against marine and their forest kin in the name of capitalist profit and environmental preservation accrue heightened significance in light of the entrenched forms of political colonization, ecological degradation, and ethnic domination that have profoundly shaped the modern history of West Papua. First colonized by the Dutch in 1882, the western half of the island of New Guinea came under the informal control of Indonesia, following the country's independence in 1949. From thence on, West Papuans have been subjected to systemic acculturation, or Indonesianisasi, a government-endorsed process aimed to strengthen national unity by incorporating Papuans through formal education, national media, economic development, and settler migration. The incorporation of West Papua into Indonesia was formalized through the controversial Act of Free Choice of 1969, when a group of Papuan men and women were handpicked by the Indonesian military and forced to vote in favor of Indonesian control. Meanwhile, Indonesian and foreign corporations plundered natural resources in Papua in the form of pulp and paper plantations, timber plantations, and copper and gold mines. Today, bureaucratic red tape and corruption, the oppressive force of the state military corporate troika, and the criminalization of indigenous individuals suspected of separatist aspirations continue to restrict the ability of Papuans to seek recognition and remedy for the violation of their rights to customary lands, traditional livelihoods, food security, and cultural continuity. The violence of the state perdures in the form of forced incarceration, physical and psychological harassment, torture, sexual violence against women, and brutal military responses to indigenous political actions, notably during the yearly commemorative raising of the Papuan Morning Star flag on the 1st of December. Against this backdrop, contemporary plantation expansion in Merauke represents but one of many manifestations of the collective history of suffering experienced by Papuans under Indonesian rule. On the one hand, state and corporate rhetoric on the benefits of oil palm expansion casts the forest-based livelihoods of Marine in a negative light, as primitive and backwards. Yet at the very same time, palm oil undermines the local food security of Marine residents, as the availability of game and plants become increasingly limited. Marine are also, ironically, routinely denied employment opportunities in the palm oil sector because they are said to be, quote, lazy, uneducated, and dirty, end quote. These jobs tend to be given instead to non-Papuan settlers, who are often said by plantation operators to be more, quote, civilized, hardworking, and hygienic, end quote. These forms of economic and racial injustice exacerbate pre-existing ethnic and religious tensions that exist in the Upper Bian between predominantly Catholic and Protestant Marine populations and the primarily Muslim non-Papuan settler population. With indigenous Papuans now representing less than 40% of Merauke's population, many Marine believe that the growing presence of migrants is an intentional strategy adopted by the government to drive West Papuans to extinction. Just like Papuans are deprived of the right to determine their political futures, so too plantation projects in Merauke are often designed and implemented without the free, prior or informed consent of indigenous landowners. Consultations, where undertaken, present projects as a fait accompli and offer limited information on the potential risks of these projects for local food security, land rights and livelihoods. Many Marine have been forced to surrender their lands in the name of, quote, national interest, end quote, and in exchange for derisory compensation. Meanwhile, promises of social welfare, such as educational and medical facilities, are rarely fulfilled. Human rights violations prompted by oil palm plantations have led to 3 consecutive submissions from civil society organizations to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination under its urgent action and early warning procedures, and 2 formal communiques to the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. To date, however, justice or remedy have yet to be delivered to Marine on the ground. The government has yet to respond to concerns over human, land and food rights violations raised directly with them by the said committee in 2011 and 2013, or to the Special Rapporteur's joint statement of 2012 regarding the adverse effects of plantation expansion on the food security of some 50,000 Marine. Contemporary oil palm expansion, then, constitutes the vegetal arm of a long-standing process of colonization, in which the exploitation of nature goes hand in hand with the dispossession of indigenous peoples. In this regard, contemporary monocrop developments in Papua speak powerfully to the historical imbrication of plantation logic with racialized forms of violence, enslavement and expropriation that are in turn rooted in and further colonial hierarchies of humanness. Far from solely an economic institution, the plantation, as Michel Rolf Trouillot puts it, is also a race-making institution. To entrench in emergent regimes of colonialism, capitalism, conservationism, what possibilities of justice exist for Marine and their other-than-human kin? For some Marine, justice takes the form of tangible goods and services that they are owed yet denied. For instance, communities, they argue, should receive from corporations profiting from their land adequate monetary compensation, decent salaries, education opportunities, health facilities, and free access to areas now designated as conservation areas. For other Marines, justice is about due process. Companies should seek the free, prior, and informed consent of landowners before designing and implementing their projects. Communities should also be fully informed of the risks and benefits of the proposed developments. Their customary and collective land tenure systems must be acknowledged, as well as their right to choose their own representatives in land-related negotiations, and their moral and practical duties of care for the well-being of kindred plants and animals. More importantly, the right of communities to say no to oil palm should at all times be respected. Yet other Marind call for justice in restorative and retributive terms. Lands lost under duress or deception should be returned to their owners, along with the crops and structures established upon them. Forest-based modes of subsistence that are undermined by monocrop conversion should be remedied in the form of alternative livelihoods and access to local and urban markets. Fines should be imposed on corporations that fail to implement social welfare projects, undermine local food and water security, and illegally burn forests to plant oil palm. Yet these different forms of justice come with different conundrums. For some of my friends, material goods and restorative measures for affected communities cannot adequately compensate for sentient environments that are already radically degraded, vegetations already decimated, bodies already contaminated, and species already driven to the brink of extinction. Rather, justice demands a genuine acknowledgement of the destructive effects of plantations on these native forests, plants, animals, and ecosystems as actors, as relations, and as kin, including, for instance, through the performance of rituals of commemoration, of mourning, of forgiveness seeking, and of redemption towards non-human animals as they are encountered and remembered through stories, songs, and myth. In tandem, many of my friends argue that multi-species justice calls for a structural move away from top-down environmental practices and their replacement with community-led forms of restoration, management, and conservation that are anchored in traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous science. For some Marind, however, these forms of grassroots environmental justice are seen to be inherently incompatible with the large-scale extractive model of the agro-industrial monocrop. For yet other Marind friends, rejecting oil palm projects makes little sense when there are few alternative opportunities for economic advancement in rural Merauke. The return of lands to local hands, these individuals argue, also comes with the risk of conflict and competition among clans, because the plants, natural markers, and structures that once demarcated the boundaries between respective territories have now disappeared. These and many other dilemmas over the form and possibility of justice give rise to tensions among Marind, and particularly between those who are attracted by the opportunities offered by the plantation sector and those who are staunchly opposed to it. These factions are referred to locally as pro and contra, for and against, but they are never stable nor bounded. As people struggle to navigate their presence into more livable futures, they constantly shift from one standpoint to another and back. As one of my friends, an elder named Pius, put it, quote, "No one knows for certain what justice might be. No one has the key. Everyone is looking for the right path," end quote. The conflicted pursuit for the right path to justice, in Pius's word, is further compounded by a morally fraught ambivalence among Marind over the causes of the violences that they are enduring and have endured historically. Some of my friends explain their plight as a punishment meted upon them by ancestral spirits, or dema, for their own failure to protect the forest and its sentient beings from destruction, and for succumbing, in some cases, to the lure of capitalist modernity. This explanation aligns with a prevalent interpretation among Marind and many other Melanesian peoples of natural disasters and illness as supernatural retribution for social and moral wrongs committed by humans towards the landscape and its life forms. Other Marind, meanwhile, attribute their injustices suffered to the hegemonic domination of the Indonesian state, to the national and international corporations working in collusion with the government, and to the global community of consumers who drive global demand for palm oil. In contrast, yet others among my friends describe their fate in the language of martyrdom, by positioning themselves as necessary victims in achieving a sort of greater good. If some humans bear the palm and profit, then others simply must bear with. And for others yet, the possibility of justice itself cannot exist until Papuans reclaim their right to freedom and self-determination as an independent nation-state. Here, political emancipation colonial rule is understood as the only avenue for genuine justice to be done to Papuan ways of being, becoming, and belonging with each other and with the sentient forest ecology. And then oil palm in all of this. As described earlier, many of my marine friends attribute the destructive effects of agribusiness to the voracious and self-interested nature of oil palm itself. However, the idea of punishing oil palm for its destructive actions was absent in my friends' discourses and reflections. In part, this is because marine are acutely aware that there are human actors driving and dictating the particular ways in which oil palm grows in Merauke and its consequent ecological effects. Indeed, oil palm is also an object of pity among many communities who contrast its totalizing subjection to human control in monocrop plantation to the freedom of native plants and animals in the realm of the forest. For instance, some of my friends described oil palm seeds as orphans because their growth and development and eventual death is dictated by humans and not by their parent palms. Many marine women expressed sorrow over the fate of oil palm fruit, or what they called oil palm children, because they are ripped away from their parent palms during the harvesting and violently flung into overloaded trucks, quote, like corpses, end quote. Many villagers, meanwhile, wondered if oil palm ever felt lonely or sad in the genetically homogeneous environment of the plantation, where few other species can survive. For Marin, then, knowing the multiple facets of oil palm's world as both a driver of harm and an object of human and technological exploitation complicates the relationship between justice and punishment. After all, oil palm too is robbed of its own lively plantiness in the realm of the monocrop, where it is deprived of its native home, multi-species relations, and autonomous growth. Marine then are not indifferent to the life world of oil palm beyond what they themselves experience in its destructive presence. Rather, they recognize that oil palm is both a subject and an object of injustice. As Petrus's father Barnabas mused, maybe oil palm too deserves freedom. Maybe oil palm too deserves justice. End quote. Let me now conclude with two very brief closing anecdotes. As anthropologist Naisar Gedeva argues, the concept of justice very acutely comes to fore precisely when justice is absent. Justice in this light can be defined as lack or absence of a form of violence of harm, for instance, not being removed from or dispossessed from one's land, not being subject to racial treatment, or not being forcefully separated from the other than human beings and ecologies that are constitutive of one's being and becoming. Perhaps then one of the qualities of justice is that even if, or precisely because it is never quite here, it is also never completely impossible. Its possibility always exists and can sometimes manifest in the form of unanticipated, more than human events. I became aware of justice's capacity to materialize in unforeseen and unintended ways in the autumn of 2015. During the months of September and October of that year, forest fires deliberately started in Indonesia to clear land cheaply for palm oil and pulp and paper plantations blanketed vast swaths of Southeast Asia with a heavy layer of toxic smog. Described by scientists as the highest release of climate-changing carbon since record blazes in 1996 and exacerbated by the El Nino drought, the haze provoked serious respiratory health problems amongst residents across Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, where most major oil palm conglomerates are headquartered, and an estimated 100,000 casualties. At around the same time, anecdote 2, rumor was spreading amongst residents of the Upper Bian region that a nearby plantation operator was on the verge of bankruptcy. Ganoderma, a resilient species of fungus, had, they said, infiltrated the plantation and was killing oil palms by the hundreds. Described by the companies as a cancer, the fungus had concealed itself in the root systems of the host and neighboring palms and then proliferated in a sudden and uncontrollable manner. Rotting yellow oil palm fronds littered the soil, which had to be completely excavated and replaced to avoid contaminated newly planted trees. A host of bacteria were being deployed by the corporation as biofungicides in a desperate attempt to inhibit fungal growth, but their short lifespan was doing little to stop Ganoderma's ravaging effects. Monocrop plantations, such as the ones proliferating across Marin's lands, testify to the unprecedented scale and impacts of human activity on the planet. But plantations also escape the seemingly totalizing control of humans over anthropogenic landscapes. If states and corporations are macro parasites of nature, then toxic gases and resilient fungi are micro parasites that operate without regard for laws or boundaries. Ultimately, no body is immune to the effects of techno-capitalist expansion, no matter how far removed we think we are from its sources and sites. Perhaps then this is the kind of justice that lies in the hands of nature itself, a nature that encompasses familiar ecosystems and kindred organisms, but also new and unexpected agents of justice, such as sovereignless toxic haze clouds and lethal fungal proliferations. Of course, not everyone, human or other, benefits and suffers from the consequences of intentional and contingent ecological transformations in the same way, nor to the same extent. For this reason, attending to the perspectives and experiences of Indigenous and other marginalized peoples who inhabit these shadow places of capitalism is critical in rethinking the possibility and form of justice within and across species lines. Tackling between justice in human and other than human terms, as Marind are teaching me to do, also invites an expansion of the concept and practice of justice beyond the here and beyond the now. It demands that we untether justice from its human-centric and individualistic premises and instead approach relations across life forms as the subject of justice, from intimate relations of mutual care to violent relations of exploitation and extraction. Grappling with justice for humans and non-humans in synchronous rather than sequential terms is no easy task. It may open new forms of hope and empowerment for some, whilst foreclosing these avenues for others. It involves traveling a path, to return to Pius's words, towards shared and livable futures, a path always already traveled alongside companions, both loving and unloving, familiar and unexpected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was just an absolutely stunning talk, and there's so much richness in the discussion that you had. I'm still trying to, digest and reflect upon it all. Um, we're now delighted to still have 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone does have a question, please do either raise your hand or post the question in the chat so we can put it to Sophie. Sophie, just to kick things off, I was really struck by that description that you had of how your friends were talking about oil palm as really greedy and not sharing and that lack of relationality, but then later also feeling that sort of pity for the oil palm. So I was just wondering, is there a sense too that the greediness is not a product inherent in the palm oil per se, but in the relations in which it's been established and in the relations in which it's been sort of enlisted into, that it's sort of become a basically a enlisted into this project of colonial plantation, but that oil palm could exist otherwise in other forms of relations and would maybe prefer to. Just sort of love to hear you unpack that a little bit further.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for getting us started, Julia. Yeah, so this understanding of oil palm as an agent of harm or perpetrator of violence is something that, on one hand, invites us to complicate the assumption that violence is necessarily or always driven by humans, and at the same time, this sort of the sort of resentment, fear, loathing that many Marin express towards this plant that is a kind of biological ally in Alfred Crosby's terms, of the state and corporations, sits alongside this kind of complex spectrum of affects, right, including pity and compassion towards a plant that might be destroying native ecologies, but that is itself, of course, its entire life is subject to all kinds of human, technological, biological, chemical manipulations as it's transformed from a lively plant into a source of profit. So in a sense, sense, it's a plant that is also stripped of its own ability to make history, to develop relationships with other organisms in the kind of, in the environment of the monoculture. It lives there alone, not with others. And for many Marins, there is an uncanny resonance then between their own dispossession of agency at the hands of the plantation industry and that of the plant itself. So it's an incredibly complex story, and it sits alongside, sentiments of wonder and curiosity as well towards the oil palm plant. One of the greatest sources of curiosity was the sort of scientific name of the oil palm plant, Elaeus guineensis, which means the olive of Guinea. Guinea here referring to African Guinea, where oil palm is native to. Many Marin would muse at length over a possible historical connection between African Guinea and New Guinea, peoples of the same color skin, now connected by this plant that has traveled across continents from one site to another. And people would wonder, how does oil palm grow back in its own native soils? What sort of relationships does it entertain with native plants and animals and humans in those native soils? What is its life world outside the constraints, the structures and the strictures of the plantation system, which they are well aware is only one of many ways in which the plant can grow, survive and thrive. So they make space for that otherwise in their musings. And so the greediness of the oil palm sits alongside pity, empathy, compassion, curiosity, and wonder. And interestingly, greed is itself a topic of a lot of debate and discussion, not just in terms of the greediness of oil palm, but also the greediness of the consumers, for whom plantations are established, who consume palm oil in their everyday, foodstuffs. And sort of greed is often associated with the global capitalist world system, right? A system that is bent on a sort of rapacious consumption of marginalized places and peoples and life forms. And yet that seems to suffer from a kind of a condition of insatiability, right? We're always hungry for more. We're never satisfied. And perhaps in the process, we then also lose sight of the important lessons that hunger can teach us, right? So it's a very complex ontology of greediness and hunger that works within and across species lines for Marin. And if you want to find out more without wanting to do a heads up, but my second book is all about that complexity of what hunger means, who is greedy, and what does it mean to, what kinds of relations of eating and being eaten should we be working towards in a world that is predicated on sort of colonial capitalism as a sort of process of, in bell hooks terms, eating the other, capitalized.
Thank you. Caitlin, you had a question as well.
So thanks so much, Sophie. That was incredible. I thought it was such a helpful way to describe the kind of process of commodification and the relation between the macro and the micro. And I was really struck by your description of states and corporations as macro parasites. I've been thinking recently about the kind of corporate state and military private imperial formations and wondering if you could tell us a little bit more. Is there something kind of specific about the way that this occurs in the oil palm plantation institution and kind of in this place? Thanks so much.
Absolutely, yes. So I borrow the language of micro and macro parasites from Peter Brown, who published an article by that same name in 1987. And here he's, as you're suggesting, sort of playing with the scalarity of parasitism, and thinking about its sort of, multi-species, but also institutional kind of manifestations. So, macro parasites, I refer to state and corporations, sort of the kind of, structural, institutional, infrastructural forces that predate on indigenous lands, bodies, and environments, and whose hegemony is very much predicated on a theft of sovereignty over these lands and bodies by indigenous peoples and their native kin. And then the sort of micro parasites. Here, I'm thinking, I'm actually drawing from the discourses of some of my Marin friends who now, for better or for worse, have found casual employment within plantations as sort of seasonal harvesters or sprayers of pesticides pesticides, and who encounter, biological microparasites of the oil palm on a daily basis. More than that, they're tasked with eradicating the parasites of oil palm. And there are some really fascinating interpretations of the agency, the moral agency of these parasitic species, right? I mentioned fungi. There's also insects and various rodents who basically, prey on the oil palm, or remake it into a source of sustenance and host. So on the one hand, these workers, in some ways, kind of, they're tasked with killing the parasites to sustain the plant that in turn sustains their own economy, right? But they're very, very conflicted about it. In killing the parasites, they're kind of killing the resistance, right? Those entities that are sabotaging the plantation project, those entities that get in the way of the techno-capitalist vision of order, discipline, control, profit, and productivity, and organisms that many anti-plantation activists would describe as agents of justice, right? A kind of retributive justice. They're basically fucking off the plantation project, and there's a certain sort of interspecies alignment and solidarity that arises between human activists and these parasites in either their shared kind of struggle against, or defiance or opposition to plantation visions. But it's not that simple for those Marines whose livelihoods are now thoroughly dependent upon plantation health and plantation growth. Then there's another kind of category of beings. I'm straying a little from parasites now, but it's your mutualists, right? The plantation is not just a space of parasitism, it's also a place of mutualism. That is to say, a place where some native fungi and insects and rodents and mammals are actually finding ways to survive and thrive in oil palm company, in kind of much more, two-way or symbiotic relations. Those species are also the object of a lot of discourses around the possibility of negotiation, compromise, mutual accommodation, learning to live with the trouble of oil palm as a potential other path towards justice. So this one's less about defiance, resistance, and sabotage. It's more about living with, negotiating, accommodating, less of future making, if you wish. So again, so often these discourses work within and across species lines, and parasites multiply, across different scales, and they also spread, zoom out to include the global consumer communities that also more or less unwittingly or consciously are also part of the story of plantation proliferation and resistance in places like Merauke.
Thanks so much. Gwen, you had a question as well.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Because I've got my headphones on. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you all for organizing this talk. That was wonderful. I just had a question regarding the story that you started with, Sophie, where the son is buried, but there's no release in death because of that kind of holistic view of reality and existence. And I was just wondering, how does that affect the project of justice? I just feel like there's no resolve possible in a sense until it's addressed. Like it's an ongoing injustice, and it's very different to the way that I guess we would see, at least, let our children go, let us let our sons go, and at least they're free now, kind of thing. But here they're not even released in death. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Gwen, for that question and inviting us to stay a little longer with Petros and his family. You're absolutely right. Justice is an impasse of sorts for so many Marian, right? It remains very much inchoate, precisely because, as you said, it's not just about justice in the here and the now. It's also about, what my friend Radhika Govindarajan describes as spectral justice, right? Forms of injustice that haunt well beyond, one's own individual lifespan, that occupies people's dreams and nightmares. Dream interpretation is a huge part of Marin's, interpretations of reality, and the injustice of not being buried with one's kin and not finding peace in the afterlife also raises for many of my friends the bigger and deep question of what ancestors they will become, right? How will they be remembered by generations in the future? So I think I wish I had a more hopeful answer to offer for you, but in these instances, the only form of justice that people do talk about is justice through acts of mourning, right? Acts of grieving. So people might not be allowed to go visit Petrus because he's buried somewhere between a plantation and a highway, but they will go. They will insist on trespassing corporate and state land. They will go and bring Sego Franz. They will go and sing. They will go and offer to Petrus the companionship of other entities that they might have salvaged along the road or in the plantations, and whether it's a young bird, whether it's the cask of a cassowary, whether it's the fur of a wild boar, whether it's the matted fronds of a nipa palm, they will continue to try to offer a kind of companionship to their child through these sort of everyday small acts of mourning. These are not acts that will transform the reality and the structural violences that result in a young child being buried in a place where they will not find peace, but they're everyday little justices. I'm borrowing Rousseau's term, right? Everyday little mundane acts of defiance and continuance and persistence that do for Marine matter, even if they do not structurally transform the situation. And many of these acts are conducted by women, by mothers, in groups, in collectives, alongside forms of singing, weaving, planting as well. And there's a kind of whole ecology of acts of mourning that do not offer justice, but offer some kind of solace, perhaps, to those who inhabit these increasingly haunting landscapes that are, in fact, increasingly dotted with makeshift graves in places that they should not be. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, Gwen, but thank you for asking.
And there's a question in the chat from Leo Bromberg, and he says, thanks for the amazing talk. I love the discussion around the different and sometimes contested accounts of justice and multi-species justice. Do you have any thoughts about institutionalizing these more expansive, different and sometimes contested or evolving accounts of multi-species justice in West Papua or more broadly?
It's a brilliant question, Lev. Thank you so much. I was preparing that part of the talk, and I was because I just throw at you all these different ways in which people think about justice, and they're all kind of entangled and contradictory. And then I'm like, I need to offer something a little bit more conclusive, but I really can't, because these conversations are so ongoing and I think productively inconclusive at the moment. So thank you for asking me it. Institutionalizing justice. This is a conversation I've had many times over with my friends. There is certainly there is a worry about institutionalization among many Marine, right? The fear of capture, including elite capture from within communities, or co-optation in that process of institutionalizing justice at the same time as people perfectly understand that it's vital to achieve the kind of structural change needed in Papua and indeed other parts of the world. But there's a kind of there's certainly a reticence there. And in fact, at times, there was a reticence even to invoke the language of justice itself, Lev, because of the way in which justice is often seen as kind of the monopoly, under the monopoly of the state, right? The justice is the law, and the law is like a knife. It's, how do they put it? It's sharp at the bottom and blunt at the top. It cuts the people hard, but it doesn't seem to cut the state and corporations as hard. So even justice, people often say we shouldn't talk about justice. We should talk about care or kinship. So it's a slippery word. I think the most useful thinking I've come across in terms of that process of institutionalizing, and less from my own ethnographic fieldwork and conversations with Marine than from another group of primarily political theorists, which is probably why they're better at this stuff than anthropologists. Danny Sellermeyer and David Schlossberg have written a lot about institutionalizing multi-species justice. They just have a book that's come out on the topic. And so they're sort of, I think, making some really important headway in that space. As someone who works closely with the local and the ethnographic ethnographic, it can be really hard to think about what scaling up these practices and discourses might look like without doing violence to the specificity and the granularity of those local interpretations. But it's certainly something that Marin sees as important. The question is who will lead, who will be the spokesperson for it, and who will benefit. So insatisfactory answer, but thank you for reminding us to think about that.
No, thank you. That's a great answer, because I think that you both of those perspectives are important. And even when you were just talking about before about the little justices, so you need to have, I think, the political theorists like Danny working on, and the wonderful work that they're doing, but also the bottom up work that you've been talking about, and they need to speak to each other. So I think that's a perfectly satisfactory answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to quickly, lest it be misattributed, the term little justice is one that I borrowed from James Roussel. I think his articles, it's little or small justices. So if anyone wants to follow up, it's a really beautiful piece that I found really good to think with. That's Roussel.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sophie. I always admire your capacity to sort of bring in such richness of scholarship from, other anthropological colleagues, as well as such richness from the accounts of the ethnographic work that you've done. It's just been absolutely phenomenal. And I think it's a really sobering reflection too, because you could imagine a form of political emancipation in West Papua that keeps all these colonial relations and these sort of forms of plantation economies that have been established through occupation intact. And that obviously wouldn't be a form of emancipation. I think you've really pushed us to think much more deeply about how that sort of form of political emancipation requires a much broader thinking about what justice is and how we conceptualize justice, much less even more the challenges of what that looks like to politically realize or institutionalize that in any way. So there'll be a lot to really take away, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time, with these stories, and with your expertise. And thank you everyone so much for coming, and we hope to see you at some of the future lectures in this lecture series.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Julia, Caitlin, Sahiba.